First, I think the president needs to see what the Chinese bring to the table in terms of the issues most of concern to the U.S. IP theft, JV and ownership restrictions, forced technology transfers. The president tends to be someone who makes his decisions at the last moment. I'm not sure he yet knows what he is going to decide. But the fundamental fact is, I think we're at the point that the only two people who can make the decision on where this relationship is going to go in trade terms will be meeting tomorrow night.
Because you have been inside meetings like this before, and maybe this is a different circumstance, there's an expectation or at least an allowance that somebody like a President Trump could do what we've been describing as calling an audible during dinner to try to make a deal. But my question has actually been around whether we think that President Xi could, quote unquote, call an audible, given just structurally how scripted these meetings are and all the preparations on both sides that go into them.
You're right. There's a lot of structure, whether it be the G20 multilaterally or the important bilateral meetings on the margins of the G20. Really quite structured. They have a whole system of Sherpas who take you to that point. At the same time, you've got, in the end, leaders who make decisions. I do think Xi could call an audible. I think he is powerful enough in their system that he could come in with a very well-prepared, very well-structured agenda. But depending on what he hears from the president, he too could call an audible.
What would be a surprise for you?
I think the surprise would be if the Chinese are willing to move on each of those areas that I mentioned and perhaps some others. We've seen some indications regarding recent decisions they've made around American Express, United Technologies, Allianz, that suggest they've gotten the message they need to open their economy a bit more. What would be a bit of a surprise is if he comes across on all four of those areas. If so, it would seem to me that the U.S. would be in a position of having, at the very least, to delay the imposition of higher tariffs on the existing products and maybe even delay the new tariffs.
You know, we talk about intellectual property all the time, and it feels like on that particular issue, deals have been struck before, attempts have been made on that issue, and even if a quote-unquote new deal is struck, whether it just turns into lip service.
Andrew, that's a very, very good point. I've dealt with the Chinese on intellectual property issues going back to the Reagan administration. By the way, not just the Chinese, other countries too. I think intellectual property has become an even more important issue. And I would say that intellectual property theft is one of the few things that unites Republicans and Democrats, Congress and White House. And the Chinese have got to get the message that they are not going to be able to continue with their IP theft if they want any kind of normal trade relationship with the U.S. And interestingly, you're seeing these same concerns in Europe, in Australia, and elsewhere.
Ambassador, there's a theory out there that I've heard repeated several times that maybe intellectual property is an area where the Chinese are finally willing to see a little more eye to eye with us on it because they finally have their own intellectual property that they want to protect as well. Do you think that's a legitimate theory?
I hope, Becky, that they start to see it being in their interest to live up to the global rules on intellectual property protection. I don't think they're there quite yet. If you take a look at the 2025 plan that they've laid out, they're looking for leap aheads in intellectual property and technology. Unfortunately, right now, I think part of that game plan includes indigenous development, forced tech transfer, but also IP theft. I think they're moving, but not quickly enough.
Ambassador, just again going back to sort of the scripted nature of these things and just the practicality of what happens when you're in the room, you know, there is a sense, I think, in the marketplace, at least right now, that you could get some kind of handshake deal. It's possible the markets, by the way, would move on that unless you think it's already baked into the way the stock market is indicated thus far. But then once people sort of look at it all, they'll say there's still details that need to get worked out. How many details can actually get worked out and signed off on in the moment?
In the moment, I think a relatively small number, Andrew. What you hope leaders will do is give you strategic direction that allows you to move quickly to implementation. People sitting around the table with the president, people backbenching these meetings, as I have many times, will be taking very careful notes on what the two leaders have agreed to. And if they're smart, they'll be putting their checklist together for how to move quickly on implementation, including with their counterparts immediately after the dinner.
Are you of the view, by the way, that we have moved from a cooperative to confrontational stance on a long-term basis with China, or is this just a temporary situation?
I'm not sure that the suggestion that we were ever cooperative with them is exactly correct. I also think confrontational is too strong. I think we're moving into a broad, global, competitive environment with China, not just on economic and financial issues, but also political, military. We are good at competing. They should be good at competing, particularly if they play by the rules. So I would say neither cooperative nor confrontational, but I think quite competitive on a going forward basis.
What do you think about the phrase trade war?
I think that's overstated at this point. We've talked about trade wars with Europe, with Mexico, Canada, with China. It's an easy phrase, Becky, to put out there. I would look underneath it. And the bottom line is, it is a competition. And actually, the global economy works well on the basis of competition. But it also works well when people play by the rules. And right now, the Chinese are not playing by the rules.
Ambassador, also wanted to get your views on the president's decision to cancel his meeting with President Putin of Russia. The right decision, the wrong decision. Obviously, there's optics issues after this new situation with Mueller and Cohen just yesterday. But he has taken what appears to be at least a rationale, a diplomatic rationale involving the Ukraine for not having that meeting. What would have you done?
I think the action the Russians took recently with regard to Ukraine crossed the line once again, just as their annexation of Crimea and their invasion of Ukraine did years ago. I think a strong signal needed to be sent, and that has led to additional sanctions and other steps in Europe. I think it was very appropriate for the president not to have a formal sit-down meeting with Putin. But listen, they're going to be in that G20 room for probably 6 to 8 hours together. Don't be surprised to see a picture of the two of them talking right on the margins. But I think the idea of not having a formal meeting was the right decision.